19th August 1942, dense jungle near Tivu Point, Guadalcanal Channel. Genjiro Imi, the second man from the left in the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, recorded in his diary observations that captured the shock many Japanese soldiers experienced when they first encountered American forces. Through a thick canopy of palms and strangler vines, Imi and the 916 other soldiers of Colonel Konaichiki's detachment had just disembarked from destroyers, completing a night insertion that the Japanese command believed would be the opening move to retake Henderson Field. They had been told the Americans numbered perhaps 2,000 men. Poorly trained, easily frightened, men ruined by lives of luxury. Colonel Ichiki himself dismissed any warning to await reinforcements. "These are Americans," he told his officers. "We will sweep them into the sea by dawn." What none of these veterans of the China and Southeast Asia campaigns understood was that they were about to confront an unprecedented phenomenon in the annals of the Imperial Japanese Army. Not merely a defeat, which was unthinkable to soldiers who had known almost nothing but victory since 1937, but a systematic demolition of every tactical assumption, every strategic concept, every ideological certainty that had defined the Japanese way of war. The jungle itself would be turned into an American weapon. The darkness that had favored Japanese operations since the start of the war would betray them. Overwhelming superiority in equipment, coordination, and destructive capacity would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat. That transformation had begun 2 weeks earlier, on 7th August, when 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division landed at Lunga Point. The Leathernecks under General Alexander Vandegrift were executing Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive in the Pacific War. On paper, the mission was straightforward: seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, and hold until relieved. In reality, they were about to wage the longest and most brutal campaign in Marine Corps history to that date, in an environment that would test human endurance to its absolute limits. The island itself was a tropical inferno. The Guadalcanal Channel stretches roughly 90 miles long by 25 miles wide, and the interior is dominated by mountains rising to 8,000 feet that sit under perpetual cloud. The coastal plain around Henderson Field was a swath of kunai grass, swamp, and jungle so thick that visibility rarely exceeded a few feet. Heat was suffocating, and humidity hardly ever fell below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds dense enough that men breathed them in. Rivers and streams that looked clear in aerial photographs were infested with parasites and disease. Malaria, typhoid, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would incapacitate more men than enemy action. Yet that first morning the Marines found the airfield nearly undefended. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops fled into the jungle, abandoning equipment, supplies, and, crucially, the airstrip itself. By the evening of 8th August, American engineers were already completing the runway. They would name it Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a naval aviator killed at Midway. Within days, the first plane would land, and the island would become home to what history would recall as the Cactus Air Force. Japan's naval response was swift and disastrous for elements of the U.S. fleet. On the night of 9th August, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and a destroyer in a bold surprise attack. The resulting surface action, the Battle of Savo Island, became the worst defeat in U.S. naval history up to that point. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sent to the bottom in less than an hour. More than 1,000 sailors died in waters set ablaze by exploding ships. The surviving Allied naval forces withdrew, taking with them most of the supplies that had not yet been unloaded. Marines on Guadalcanal were stranded and isolated, facing an enemy reinforced at sea and operating with perhaps half the equipment and rations they needed. What the Japanese High Command failed to grasp in those first days of August was that Henderson Field had become the key. Possession of the airfield meant daytime control of the surrounding sea approaches. Aircraft operating from Henderson could attack Japanese ships within a radius of some 200 miles, and that alone determined the character of the campaign. The Japanese could dominate the night, using fast destroyers to move troops and supplies along supply routes that would be labeled the Tokyo Express. By day, however, American aircraft dominated the skies. Strategically, Japan needed to regain Henderson Field immediately before U.S. forces could entrench and reinforce. The Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task to the 17th Army under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, based at Rabaul. Hyakutake had only limited forces available. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was stationed at Palau. Other units were dispersed across the theater. The closest available formation was the 28th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Ichiki, then posted near Guam and originally intended for Operation MI, the planned Midway invasion that had been canceled after Japan's naval setback in June. Ichiki was an infantry school instructor reputed to be a first-class tactician. He was also impulsive and supremely confident in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over American materiel. Before leaving Truk for the Guadalcanal Channel, Ichiki received clear orders to wait for the remainder of his regiment before attempting to retake the airfield. Ichiki, however, had little respect for American soldiers. He had studied reports from China and the Philippines and concluded that Western troops lacked discipline, broke under pressure, and could not match Japanese warriors in close-quarters combat. On the night of 18th August, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men, the first element of Ichiki Idi's force, to Tenaru Point, some 15 miles to the east of the American perimeter. The landing was unopposed and undetected by U.S. forces. Ichiki immediately sent out reconnaissance patrols to assess enemy strength and positions. That routine tactical decision would prove fatal. On 19th August, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, commanded by Captain Charles Brush, moved along the coastal route toward Kohi Point and encountered Japanese soldiers. The two forces clashed in a brief, fierce firefight. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and captured documents that revealed the presence of a significant enemy force in the area. More important, the captured papers showed that the Japanese had severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with the intelligence. General Vandegrift immediately understood what was coming: a Japanese attack, probably from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to bolster defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines called the Tenaru River, actually the Ilu River, though the misidentification would stick in later accounts. Cates deployed the 2nd Battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Lewis J. Chesty Puller's regiment along the riverbank, with machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar. What followed would become one of the most one-sided battles in Marine Corps history. Rather than wait for information from his missing patrol or for reinforcements, Ichiki decided to attack immediately. On the night of 20th August and into the early hours of 21st August, he ordered a frontal assault across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized the superiority of the fighting spirit and bold night assaults as methods to overcome enemy firepower. Ichiki believed his veterans could break American defenses through sheer daring and close combat where Japanese soldiers had excelled with bayonets and grenades. Shortly after midnight, Jacob Vuza, a scout from the Solomon Islands who had escaped Japanese captivity after brutal interrogation, reached the Marine lines and warned that the Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the attack began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged over the sandbar, shouting battle cries, firing rifles, and heaving grenades. They ran directly into a prepared killing zone. Water-cooled Browning M1917A1 machine guns opened up. These weapons, designed and refined since World War I, became the anonymous heroes of naval firepower on the beach. Each gun could sustain a high rate of fire as long as its water jacket was not allowed to boil dry. Marines had sighted them in mutually supporting positions so that no sector of the sandbar went unprotected. Japanese attackers fell in waves as .30 caliber bullets tore through flesh and bone. Those who crossed the sandbar faced 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister, essentially giant shotgun cartridges that shredded men at close range. The assault continued for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese troops surged into the gunfire. Some made it to Marine positions and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Marines fought back with rifles, knives, tools, and bare hands. The defenses held. Interlocking fields of fire prevented a Japanese breakthrough. By dawn, Ichiki's attack had been utterly broken. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallows. Approximately 128 survivors, mainly support troops who had remained close to the landing area, slipped into the jungle. They would radio a report of disaster back to the 17th Army headquarters. Colonel Ichiki himself was among the dead. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Japanese official reports claimed he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted he died leading the final charge. Marine casualties were comparatively light, roughly 40 dead and wounded. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese troops was profound. Captured papers and post-war testimony recorded a pervasive shock. An entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans had not behaved as Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic under nocturnal attack. They did not break when confronted by screaming, bayonet-armed attackers. Instead, they waited in prepared positions, allowed the Japanese to enter the kill zones, and systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. Examination of captured equipment and the battlefield confirmed a more devastating revelation. American material wealth was far greater than Japanese intelligence had assumed. The Browning machine guns refused to jam. They did not overheat beyond their design limits. They did not fail for lack of spare parts. Each Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than a whole Japanese squad. The artillery support available to the Marines surpassed anything the Japanese could deploy. Coordination among infantry, artillery, and naval gunfire formed an integrated system of destruction Japanese forces had not encountered. Within days of the Tenaru disaster, more Japanese reinforcements were en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a massive naval effort to support another attempt to retake Henderson Field. On 16th August, 3 slow transports sailed from Truk, carrying the remaining 1,400 men of Ichiki Anis Regiment, plus some 500 naval infantry. After the Eastern Solomon Islands naval engagements inflicted heavy damage on one of the transports, Japanese commanders decided to abandon slow transports in favor of destroyers for subsequent supply runs. The Tokyo Express. Between 29th August and 4th September, several destroyers and light cruisers ferried nearly 5,000 troops of Major General Kawaguchi, A.S. 35th Brigade to Tevu Point. The Tokyo Express was an extraordinarily effective way to move troops. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to the Guadalcanal Channel in a single night, thereby minimizing exposure to American air attack. The method's critical weakness, however, was that heavy equipment could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and, most importantly, sufficient food and ammunition had to be left behind. Logistical reality would doom any Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Troops arrived with only what they could carry depending on local foraging and whatever supplies could be slipped through American lines. As the campaign progressed, Japanese soldiers would find themselves fighting not only American firepower, but hunger itself. Major General Kawaguchi set 12th of September as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan called for a three-pronged attack. One force would advance from the west along the coastal plain. A second would attack from the south, pushing through dense jungle toward what Japanese intelligence believed to be the weakest point in the American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, advancing along an interior ridge that overlooked Henderson Field. Unknown to Kawaguchi, naval and marine intelligence had already identified that ridge as the most likely approach, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson, commander of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, had conducted a reconnaissance of the Tasimboko area on 8 September and discovered large stores of Japanese supplies, which indicated a major concentration of enemy forces. Edson immediately realized the Japanese plan. They would come from the south using the ridge as their axis of advance. Edson requested permission to establish a defensive line on the ridge. General Vandegrift approved. On 10 and 11 of September, Edson positioned roughly 840 Marines, his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion, along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same meticulous care that had characterized the Tenaru defenses: interlocking machine gun fields, registered mortar positions on likely approaches, and artillery support plans from the 11th Marines. All advantages of terrain and firepower were calculated and prepared. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine about 1,000 meters long, composed of 3 distinct knolls covered in kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep gullies flanked both sides, densely forested and in places effectively impassable. The ground was ideal for a night infiltration attack, and if defended properly, a killing ground. On the night of 12th September, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's frontal charge, this was a more sophisticated operation. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the gullies on both sides of the ridge, attempting to envelop American positions. Small units probed for weak points. Where they found gaps, larger forces concentrated to punch through. The combat was savage and chaotic. In darkness, Marines sometimes fought hand-to-hand with Japanese soldiers who had managed to penetrate into grenade range. Nevertheless, the prepared defenses held. When Japanese units massed to break through, Marine mortars and artillery destroyed them. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night, lobbing high explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel occasionally struck friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red in the dark. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, trench tools, and whatever improvised weapons were at hand. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the Tenaru attack, moved along the line encouraging men and identifying Japanese infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone occupied a machine gun position that proved critical to the defense. When his gun crew were killed or wounded, Basilone continued firing alone, repelling wave after wave of attackers. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Marines would be awarded the Medal of Honor for their conduct on Edson's Ridge, and 19 would receive the Navy Cross. At dawn on the 13th of September, the Japanese attack had failed to break through, but Kawaguchi still had additional troops and prepared to renew the assault the following night. Edson pulled his lines toward the center of the ridge and consolidated his men. Edson Ash's Ridge, later known as Bloody Ridge, became an enduring testament to the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine. For surviving Japanese soldiers, the battle represented another deep shock to their understanding of war. Captured diaries and post-war testimony repeatedly arrived at the same conclusion. They had expected to fight infantry in darkness, where training and spirit would decide the day. Instead, they encountered artillery, machine guns, and mortars applied with a precision they could not match. American commanders anticipated Japanese attacks, prepared killing zones, allowed the enemy to enter them, and then destroyed the attackers with coordinated fire support. The patterns established at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge repeated throughout the Guadalcanal Campaign. Japanese forces continued to rely on night attacks, courage, and expertise in close combat. American forces responded with concentrated firepower, integrated combined arms operations, and carefully prepared positions designed to maximize their advantages. The result was predictably lopsided. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. American losses were significant but sustainable. Numbers alone, however, failed to capture the horror of jungle war. The environment itself became an impartial killer. Malaria infected nearly every man who remained on the island for more than a few weeks. By December 1942, The 1st Marine Division reported more than 8,000 cases of malaria. Tropical disease incapacitated roughly 2/3 of the division at various times. Men suffered fungal infections that ate the skin, jungle rot that produced sores that would not heal in the heat and humidity, and dental problems that resulted in systemic infections. Japanese troops suffered still more. Their logistical situation meant from the outset that food was inadequate. Soldiers were supposed to receive field rations, but the Tokyo Express rarely delivered sufficient quantities. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage, supplemented occasionally by rice deliveries that had to be stretched to the limit. Hunger became a constant companion. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Quinine to prevent and treat malaria ran out quickly and was not reliably replenished. Wounded men frequently died of infections easily treatable with adequate medication. Captured Japanese documents later in the campaign painted a horrifying picture. One medical officer's report from late October stated that more than 60% of the 17th Army AS forces in the Guadalcanal Channel were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition, and that effective combat strength had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized levels. Soldiers died at a rate of 50 per day, most from hunger and disease rather than from wounds. American supply lines, though occasionally interrupted, generally proved far more reliable. U.S. supply ships, protected by aircraft operating from Henderson during daylight hours, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Shortages were acute in August and early September when naval defeats temporarily isolated the Marines, but these were temporary. By October, the flow of supplies became dependable. Marines consumed canned rations that, while unappetizing, provided necessary calories and nutrition. Ammunition became plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire until barrels needed replacement and request spares. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capacity, plasma for transfusions, sulfa drugs to treat infections, and the evacuation of grievous cases to rear area hospitals. Japanese logistics, by contrast, meant doing everything that would fit on destroyer decks or could be slipped through in small numbers. Men learned to make one rice ball last a full day. Ammunition was conserved to the point where orders often restricted fire to only absolutely necessary moments. Medical care meant a bandage if one was lucky, amputation without anesthesia if one was unlucky, or death if infection set in. Severely wounded soldiers were sometimes given grenades and left to die rather than be a burden or risk capture. By late October, Japanese commanders launched their largest offensive of the campaign. Lieutenant General Hyakutake came to the Guadalcanal Channel to take personal command, bringing elements of the 2nd Division, including units experienced in China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the principal effort from the south across jungle similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, Japanese forces would have more men, somewhat better coordination, and artillery support delivered aboard destroyers. The offensive began on 23 October with preliminary attacks from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare in the Guadalcanal theater because of transport difficulties, led an assault across the Matanacao River. U.S. defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Regiment of the American 41st Infantry Division, stood ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and an M3 Stuart light tank destroyed the 9 Japanese tanks in rapid succession. The attack failed with severe Japanese losses. The main assault occurred on the night of 24 to 25 October. Approximately 500-600 Japanese soldiers under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, hoping to break American lines south of Henderson Field. They confronted the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by units of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The struggle that night acquired legendary status in Marine Corps history. Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night. Individual penetrations were sealed by immediate counterattacks. Machine guns fired until they failed. Then Marines continued the fight with rifles and bayonets. The 11th Marines carried out dangerous close-fire missions that landed within yards of defensive positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington and other naval units stood by to provide gunfire support if required. At a crucial moment, only a battalion of Marines stood between Japanese forces and Henderson Field, yet they held. Sergeant John Basilone, already distinguished at Bloody Ridge, played a central role in the defense. When ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, Basilone personally carried ammo forward under heavy fire to keep the guns operating. He repaired damaged machine guns in the open and led a small counterattack with a .45 caliber pistol when an artillery position was overrun, actions that helped restore the line. By dawn on 25 October, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was killed by machine gun fire during one of the night assaults. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt. U.S. losses numbered in the hundreds killed and wounded, serious but sustainable.